I went to college and then went to law school. I worked as a DA in Manhattan for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And then I became an environmental lawyer. And I ended up starting this group called Riverkeeper. My first case was representing the NAACP up on the Hudson River in Austining, New York. The city of Austining wanted to build a waste transfer station in the oldest black neighborhood in New York State, which is in Austining. It's a neighborhood that's been there since before the Civil War. And it wasn't, they weren't poor, they just didn't have the political clout to keep that waste transfer station moving. And they asked me to represent them, and I did, and we killed that proposal. Then I went to work for fishermen on the Hudson River. And we started a group called Riverkeeper. We have, on the Hudson, we have the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represented for the past 35 years come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. You guys see the Hudson and you see this sort of dirty water, but there's so many fish. It's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon.
Yeah, that scares me. That scares me.
There's sturgeon in that river that are 11 feet long.
And how many heads do they have?
They have 200 pounds of caviar in them.
Wow.
And there used to be a huge caviar fishery on the Hudson, but there's striped bass and sturgeon and herring and alewives and blue crab and bluefish and all the saltwater fish. Because the Hudson is tidal all the way up to Albany.
Right.
And it rises, so the salt line goes up the river, and we've had sharks and even whales go all the way up 30 or 40 miles up the river. But we have this commercial fishery that I represented, and it's most of the people in that fishery are up in Crotonville, New York, a little village. And the people there are not your prototypical environmentalists. They're factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or crabbing the Hudson. And in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe into the Croton-Harmon rail yard, from the rail yard into the river. And the oil went up on the river on the tides and it blackened the beaches and made the shad taste of diesel. So they couldn't sell them down here at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. This was a very patriotic village. And Crotonville had one of the highest mortality rates in World War II of any community in our country. Almost all of the original founders and board members of Riverkeeper, my group, were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea. They weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence. And somebody said they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, but they were given the bum's rush. They were told, these are important people, Penn Central Railroad, the richest people in the state, we can't force them to comply with the law. Right. And all of these men and women, 300 people, came together in this American Legion Hall in March of 1966, and they started talking about violence. And somebody said that they should put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a wrap mattress up the pipe and jam it up there and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else said they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then this guy stood up who was a former Marine, and he was the outdoor writer for Sports Illustrated. His name was Bob Boyle, and he said he had researched, he had done an article about angling in the Hudson, about people. There was these fishing clubs, sewer fishing clubs in New York City that were fascinating, and people who were fished up and down the river, 200 species of fish. In this article 2 years before, And in researching it, he found this ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act that said it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And nobody had ever enforced this law before. And on that night, he stood up in front of them with a copy of that law, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they started a group that night called the Hudson River Fishermen. It later became Riverkeeper, and they started suing polluters.
Wow.
And 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They got to keep $2,000. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe. They used that money to go after Ciba-Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brand, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, winning tens of thousands of dollars in bounties. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against the corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics from Hastings, New York. They used that money to build a boat, and they began patrolling the river, and they hired me as their full-time attorney. And we sued over 500 polluters on the river. We forced them to spend $5 billion.
Wow.
And today the Hudson's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic, and the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of river keepers, water keepers all over the world. So we now have 350 of them, each with a patrol boat. And it's the biggest water protection group on Earth.
Wow.
You know, one of the things I mentioned is that, you know, one of the things I learned very early on, I did a lot of work here, you know, in Harlem and you know, elsewhere, is that pollution disproportionately harms the poor. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America is in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in America is Amiel, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dump in America is the south side of Chicago.
Wow.
The most contaminated zip code is East LA. And, you know, probably, you know, you can name a lot of problems that the black community has, but, you know, one of the worst is toxicity, is, you know, that comes from lead, that comes from these
That comes from white men.
toxic exposures, yeah.
Wow.
And bad food, by the way. I mean, 75% of food stamps are spent on processed food, which is just poison. It's just poison. 10% goes to soda. But, you know, black kids in Harlem have 44% of them have toxic levels of lead in their blood. They are more likely to die of a brain tumor than a bullet. And they're most likely to die of suicide than anything else now, today, since the pandemic.
Wow.
And these are environmental exposures, and you know, they're and you know, it's a huge issue that I've been litigating on for many years. I sued at one point. I sued the New York City water supply. New York has the best drinking water in the world of any city. It has this incomparable taste that accounts for the amazing taste, unique taste of New York City pizza, New York City bagels.
Yeah, I do taste tap water in the kitchen sometimes. I ain't gonna lie. Yeah, it's there.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
And it comes from 2 water supplies. One of them in the Catskills that's very, very pure. Two, the Delaware and Catskill system, very, very good water. On the east side of the Hudson is the Croton system, and it's very small. It's only 10% of the water, but it has 102 sewage treatment plants discharging into it, and there's no filtration. So that the water from those wastewater treatment plants is going right to people's taps.
Wow.
And during the, you know, dry summer months, if you drink a cup of coffee, if you're in the distribution district for that Croton water, your cup of coffee is going to be about 3% sewage from, you know, a plant that's been through a plant.
Wow.
Oh, I asked New York City to give me the distribution because I want to see the neighborhoods that were getting this. And they wouldn't. They said it was national security. This was long before 9/11. This is like in the 90s, right? And so I sued them. And for a year, they stonewalled me, and then they gave me the distribution maps on the courthouse steps. And the maps had the neighborhoods that were getting the Croton water were colored dark on those maps. And it was Harlem, South Bronx, Lower East Side, Hell's Kitchen.
Wow.
And there was, when you went down the Upper East Side, there was one little tiny dot of white where it was getting the good water in this kind of sea of blackness. And I had to get the magnifying glass out to look at it. It was Gracie Mansion. So the mayor's house was getting the good water, but all the surrounding neighborhoods were, getting the poor water.
And whose fault is that? Who's directly to blame for that happening? Who made the decision that this water goes to these places?
You know what it is? It's not so much, I don't believe it's from direct racism. I think it's from the powerlessness of the Black community. They know people can't complain. You know this sewage treatment plant that's over in North Harlem on the west side? It's called the North River plant. That plant was supposed to be put at the 79th Street boat basin, which is the logical place for that plant because that boat basin was the outlet of a river.
Right.
And that's where you want the sewage because it means you're going down grade that it's the bottom of a gradient of a watershed, so you don't have to put in pumps, and it's very cheap because the water flows directly into that plant, right? The same that all the water in that area. Well, they tried to put it on 79th Street, but the people who were at 79th Street said, we don't want it here. And they were wealthy people. So they could call the mayor, they'd given him contributions, et cetera, and said, you got to move this. We don't want this here. We paid a lot for these properties. The smell of that plant is going to degrade our property values. Do not put it here. So they kicked it uptown again and again and again, and it finally landed. You guys know where it is, right? Right under almost to the George Washington Bridge. But that's not, that big plant. It's out in the river, right? And that neighborhood is not a poor neighborhood. It's black, but it's not poor. It's professionals who live there. It's like doctors, lawyers, people of means, people who own their own apartments, et cetera. But they just weren't connected. And so they did not have the political clout to kick it somewhere else. Right. And that's how, to me, I see this environmental racism all the time.
Right.
But I've never found papers where people said, let's put this in a black neighborhood. It's just, that's where the place of least resistance when it comes to,
It doesn't have to say black neighborhood on it for it to be racist. Or for that to, even if it's passive racism. We know who doesn't have the power. We know who's not going to fight back. Bunch of people who have means and who are doing well still end up with a sewage treatment plant because these guys didn't want it. Are you seeing what you're saying?
I know.
For the same reason that there's more police presence in impoverished neighborhoods because they don't have the money to fight the cases.
This trapper turn smack rapper. Only smack rapper that you know is smack rappers. Got bars I can hang with the backpackers. Trap star, I don't hang with the backpackers. I'm in the hood with the work you heard. Making fiends leave earth you heard. Got your baby mama thirst you heard. Feel the flow, nigga, throw it in reverse. This the way you need to surf you heard.